Hey everyone, welcome to the Earthshot podcast. Today I have with me Anthony Stevens, who's the head of innovation of the digital assets and financial markets at Northern Trust. Thanks so much for being on today.
Hey Troy, how are you? You well?
I'm doing great. It's the day after Thanksgiving, and also about a week after COP. So there's been a lot of movement in carbon markets. Well, at least we'll see what movement comes out of that. Maybe if you want to just start and just to sort of level set the audience a bit, like who are you? What is Northern Trust, and what is the top level summary of how you guys are engaged in carbon markets today?
Yeah, no problem. First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure. Um, so I'm Anthony Stevens. I guess I build products for Northern Trust. So it's probably worth giving you a bit of background about Northern. So Northern Trust, Chicago-based bank, 135 years plus in existence. We have three sort of main businesses. We have an asset servicing business that looks after pension funds, asset managers around the world, sovereign wealth funds. We have a asset management business, and we have a private client and high net worth in business, which is mainly in the US, but some into Europe. I sort of span all three areas of that, and I tend to build products using new solutions or new technology that will allow customers to get access to digital assets. So whether that be currencies moving towards sort of stable coins, or whether it be cryptocurrencies, or whether it be digitalizing real assets. So carbon's a good example. So I've been within our innovation team for about 10 years. I've been at the bank for nearly 20. As a bank, we look after about $17 trillion of assets. So quite a lot of other people's money. And our primary goal is to keep people's money safe. That's really what we do. We keep assets safe. We look after them, and we make sure that that owner of that asset has it and can transfer it safely and for cash. That's really what our job is. So in the old days, we really used to look after people's stuff. Put it in a safe, make sure it was nice and safe, didn't lose it. That was our job, and still is. There's three or four custody banks left really in the US. And we've been, like I say, we've been going around for a long time. And when we started looking at carbon markets, it was because we wanted to be able to look after the carbon credit on behalf of our clients in a custodial type structure.
So this is really interesting. I mean, Northern Trust, I don't think it's not a household name like the sort of big retail banks, but among a certain set of institutional clients or high net worth individuals, it's quite a respected institution. And so this is also signaling, oh, maybe there's a moment of maturation for carbon markets where an organization like Northern Trust is actually jumping in. And maybe if you just want to share of like, okay, so you're you know being a custodian on behalf of these large clients, like how is that related to carbon markets, and what are you doing right now with that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and quite a lot of people within Northern asked me the same question 3 years ago when we started this: is why are we getting into this market? So the long and short of it is there is an asset that belongs to somebody that has a value and needs to be looked after, and it needs to be transacted and settled in the same way as any other financial asset would do. So the way that we started to look at this was, what is a carbon credit, and legally and under what regulations does that carbon credit transact in the US? So we have a number of customers who are looking, or were and are looking, to invest into, nature, the world, the future. And they have been looking at how do they deploy their capital to ensure that project developers can carry on doing what they're doing, that there is a market for these credits, that they can have the asset and transact it. And some of that might have been sort of early stage funding, where they wanted to make sure their money was being used and what did they get back for that money that was being deployed. Um, and some of it was because they wanted to buy carbon credits against their own footprint. So you're absolutely right. Most people probably haven't heard of Northern Trust. And actually, that's probably a good thing, because our job is really to sort of, is infrastructure. So if you've heard of us, it's probably not in a good way in a lot of cases, right? So we basically manage a lot of people's money, and we move that money around our platforms every day. So the fact that you've not heard of us means we haven't made any mistakes and we don't get into the press for all the wrong reasons. So when we entered this business, the whole idea was trying to figure out how do we take the valuable asset that belongs to the project developers, who've done all the hard work to capture or avoid that, CO2 equivalent. How do we put that into a shape where they can monetize it or use it for, to lend against capital that needs to be given to them, or actually just to transact it securely for cash that they can redeploy? So the challenge really for us was, what is the asset? And I think a lot of people have probably been trying to figure this out for a long time. Is we also don't know what project developers do. They do their best to avoid or remove CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere. We needed to turn that into something that was more tangible, that could sit within our custodial platforms and prove ownership and then prove transfer. So we started this piece of work probably over 3 years ago, working with the sort of regulatory landscape as to what is a carbon credit. And if you look at every domicile through the world, they probably see that carbon's a different thing. So we looked very much in the US. We're based in the US. We wanted to make sure that we had a product that was domiciled in the US. And we spent a lot of time working with commodity lawyers, with digital asset lawyers, and with general custody lawyers to look at what the asset is. So, and some people, are still going to disagree, but a carbon credit underneath US rules, it is a non-financial environmental commodity. And a compliance market credit is that the CFTC looks after that asset because they run a derivative market on it. So they have to look after the underlying. A voluntary credit is no different from its construct. So you've got this intangible commodity, and what you've got to try and do is get that into a digital format that you can hold within somebody's account, and there is value associated to it. And that's really what we've been doing for the last couple of years.
So to me, this is really interesting because most of the conversation around carbon markets, I think, ignores the actual underlying financial infrastructure needed to make it function in a way that a normal financial institution could participate in. And so often, like, the conversation is, oh, Vera, the new methodology, or projects that are doing well or doing not well, community issues. Maybe there's some, like, comments. If you're sort of a policy wonk and really deep into this, you can talk about Article 6 and nationally determined contributions. That's what most of the conversation is about. And it's only when you are maybe like an Earthshot team member, or a project developer, or someone that's in the industry, they're like, oh, actually, how do I write a contract to go and either sell the carbon, which is sort of like the most normal use case, like, hey, you give me cash, I give you a credit. And then the a bit more esoteric use case, but actually one of the primary use cases at Earthshot is, I want to do a carbon streaming deal, or I want to run a project finance transaction, or I want to sell a future carbon credit, or I want to do a pre-purchase agreement. And all of those, it's like the rails are not standardized yet. And so every contract is custom, every sort of like settlement type is not necessarily like, oh, we actually know how to do this because we've done it before. Like, nobody's actually really done that before, a handful of institutions. So the fact that Northern Trust is interested in this space and putting a real bet in is a really positive sign. So maybe if you just want to share a bit of, like, the what's the state of the carbon market today, and maybe there's a corollary to, like, I don't know, renewable energy or another comparable asset class that would be like, okay, here's the place on the curve where we are.
Yeah. So you've hit the nail on the head, Troy, as to why we wanted to do what we did. Right. So if I take the current carbon market, and I'm not going to diss anything, right? The carbon market grew up trying to do the right thing. And you sort of get into slightly little bad habits because you're sort of trying to make sure that you've got finance moving back into project developers. And so that's how the market grew up. When we looked at it from a financial market point of view, and just a construct point of view, it sort of didn't make sense. You had a register of a thing, and we didn't really know what the thing was. So you've got registers that are generally associated to the applicable standards bodies, so, the standards of the registers, what I call them. We thought that those two things should be split apart because as far as I'm concerned, the register is where you move the asset from left to right, the ownership. But current registers, as we know them in the market today, do not move the asset. They move a recordation of who is the owner or who they've been told the owner is. So if you've got a register today, you tell the register to move the credit from myself to you. That doesn't mean we've moved ownership. It just means I've told them that the ownership has moved. Outside of that, you've then got some sort of legal contract that the project developer and the buyer signs and generates and signs. And those two, that contract doesn't then get tied back to the actual movement of the credit because nobody goes and checks that contract to make sure that you're moving the credit correctly. So if we assume that it is a property right to an environmental claim, is that paper legal contract correct in the way that it moves things? And the only people that know are the two parties that have signed it because nobody else gets to see it. There's no sort of normal construct. And then cash moves, and generally cash will move whenever the buyer decides to pay. So three things that are completely dislocated. And as any financial market, you put those three things together so that your legal contract triggers a cash movement that triggers the asset to move. And ideally, you want to do that instantly. So in a sort of delivery versus payment model, or really on an instantaneous process. So sign the contract, that triggers the movement of the cash, and then off goes the credit in the other way. So what we did is what we do for lots of our asset transactions is we just put them all onto one platform. So we've embedded into, because we could create this financial asset on platform, so we could embed the property right to the ownership of the environmental claim. We then built the legal construct that allows the physical delivery of that commodity from the project developer to the buyer or from the owner to the buyer, and cash moves before then the credit moves. So we've embedded the whole thing together. So we're probably the first entity that we know of, and probably because of who we are as a bank, that's been able to embed that property right directly onto the recordation within our system and transact it. So when you transact something on our platform, you know that the asset is owned by the project developer. The due diligence that I do is not onto the project and the methodology, it's onto the ownership of the environmental claim. So do you own it? Are you allowed to sell it? Could anybody else claim that they own that environmental claim? Once we've ascertained that we can record it on behalf of the owner, it can then be sold through this internal transaction process. So we've sort of built an ecosystem that allows everyone to transact. So, and the reason we did that is because we wanted it to look like other things that act in similar ways, right? So, having an intangible commodity is really hard to get your head around. And then to put the property right of that onto an asset to then transact it, all embedded, has sort of freaked a few people out. Because for the last 15 years, they've been used to this market with all of these different ways of transacting. And we've sort of come in and said, yeah, you don't want to do it that way. We want to do it this way.
So maybe I just reflect back because this honestly gets fairly esoteric for a lot of people. So what you're suggesting is that registry bodies and standards bodies. So let's talk about Vera or one of the other voluntary registry bodies, or newer standards bodies like Isometric or Equitable Earth. That actually what you're suggesting is that they should be developing methodologies and saying credits can be issued on this project. Say like, oh yeah, this project complied. We ran the audit process. Yes, you can issue these credits, and then each time they issue credits, but the actual ledger of who owns that credit and what account it lives in should be a separate organization that's sort of like purpose built with experience in that field, because Vera or these other bodies, that's actually not their native native state.
It's not their
This
skill
is
set.
something that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
they started developing capacity in, but it's more like the security equivalent of sending emails about who owns the asset versus like having it be a centralized ledger. That's
I totally agree. So, my view with all of these things has always been you need to be accountable and responsible for what you are delivering as a product and a service. And you should probably have capital behind you to then cover any mistakes that you make that cause a customer or a purchaser of those credits to be out of pocket. So what applicable standards bodies are very good at is methodology and governance. And that's, I think, where they should focus, because that's what they're very good at. They are good at ensuring that the methodologies are peer reviewed, they meet current climate science, they are updated, and they then will work with project developers to make sure that those project developers are using the correct maths and governance function. What happens if there's a reversal? What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens? That's all should be managed by the applicable standards bodies. They're very good at that. They should continue to be doing that. They should continue to develop out more digital ways of doing that and easier ways of onboarding and easier ways of checking. But that's the bit that they should focus on. When a project then comes along for verification, it's obviously the VVB that comes on and does that verification. So another third party who is independent comes in and looks at the methodology, the governance, the applicable standards, and the project outcomes and goes, are you meeting all those requirements? And that independent body is the first time that an environmental claim is created. So that is the issuance process, is through that verification report. So the applicable standards bodies do not issue credits. The verification report comes along and says, Mr. Project Developer, you have delivered to your rules, and that means you've captured or removed or avoided 1,000 tons. That piece of paper, that verification report, you could sell because that's where your environmental claim is embedded. And that VVB should be accountable and responsible for ensuring that it does its work correctly. And in effect, it's auditing the process. What we do is we're just the recordation, the transaction and the settlement of those environmental claims. So you shouldn't have to have an applicable standards body and a registry embedded together. The reason that they happen this way is sort of history. It's because when these
Like there wasn't
applicable
another
standards,
option. There wasn't a Northern
exactly,
Trust in the field at
exactly,
that time.
exactly, and they also had to get paid for something. So when the applicable standards body started, project developers didn't have enough money to pay them up front for what is the valuable bit of resource that they provide, which is the methodology and governance. And so they sort of backed out the payment to the transaction of the credits, because it's such a long time for some projects to get the credits, have them recorded and then sell them. They didn't have any money to pay the applicable standards bodies. So they said, well, actually, we'll give you this bit for free, or certainly at a reduced cost, and you pay us more when you've sold the credits. So I understand why the market happened this way. But the valuable bit is the governance function. And yet you're paying for settlement, because that's sort of when you get the money to pay for governance. So the market needs to sort of now just sort of flip itself on its head a little bit, which is, let's split out governance and the registry. We're very good at doing registry work because that's what we do all day long, right? We settle transactions for cash and we're very good at it, and we put our balance sheet behind it. So we're also accountable and responsible for those transactions on platform.
So this sounds like a great idea. And one of the things that I've struggled with working in carbon markets is that we can create the perfect system of the future, but it also has to meet the market where it is today so it can be applicable today. So I'm just curious, like, what progress have you made to actually have this see the light of day with standards bodies that currently exist today, with sort of regulatory environment with the past few years where actually the standards and methodologies themselves have been criticized, where maybe the BBBs were not were like appeared to not have done the appropriately robust work to assess that the projects should actually be registered and have those verification events. So having the settlement behind it doesn't fix these upstream challenges either. So I'm just curious, so like, okay, where are we today and how do we get to that future where this is actually like, people no longer criticize the carbon market because it's just so boring and works so well in the background that it's not really an issue anymore. Like we're not quite there yet.
No, we're definitely not. So no, we don't. We're not fixing some of those problems. And actually, you could probably say that we've probably made some of the things worse, right? Because we've added another way of thinking about the carbon markets into a carbon market that's currently in flux, right?
Mhm.
So the last couple of years, you haven't seen the markets grow as we'd hoped they would. And with a lot of things happening around the world at the moment, you're seeing a lot of companies look at their decisions to purchase voluntary credits and maybe are questioning some of those decisions. And flows are definitely in a different place than they were a few years ago. And I don't think that that's all down to, you know, the news and what's been going into the market. I think there's just been a little bit of a change in where they're thinking about whether they want to spend money and how do they want to do that for the best. So, can we change some of this? Yes, we can. So, the likes of Northern coming into this space, gives some gravitas. We're an old company, 135 years plus. We are a safe and secure financial institution. And to move into this market, we've done this in a very considered, sensible, conservative way. So the application that we've built and the legal construct probably gives a lot more clarity to a project developer about what their asset is. So if we say today that they have a piece of paper, which is their verification report, which is where their embedded environmental claim is, and they've got a register today that is just a record of who owns it, but it doesn't actually mean that they do own it because they've not looked at the legal construct. We can at least say to a project developer that the environmental claims that you've worked so hard to get are in your account and they're in your name and they are worth 1 ton of CO2e per ton of credit that you've got in there. And they're owned by them and they can clearly see that they are, and they're a financial asset within our structure. So they can use those assets. If they don't want to sell them, they can use them as collateral. They can put them into a loan structure. They can hold them. They can do other things, but we are responsible for those assets. The bits around, have the project developers done their job properly and have the governance functions done their job properly? That is a role for the governance functions to get right, because that's what they do. That's their special sauce, and that's the valuable bit. So the VARs of this world, the gold standards of this world, the ICRs, they have got to provide the right levels of governance. And if they don't, people won't use them and projects would go somewhere else. And that may become a slightly different market force than having, in some cases, they're sort of charitable structures. They need to become for-profit businesses that can then put the right amount of resources in to build out the right structure so they're doing their jobs properly. And I think there is a change to that. We're also seeing some of those applicable standards bodies already start to make decisions that they shouldn't be running those registers themselves, and they're starting to look at deals around other people managing them for them. Right.
Mhm.
So I think we're starting to see that change, Troy, within the market. But I think the bottom line is that more people need to come into the market and buy credits, which gives more money to the applicable standards bodies to start doing some of these functions, or institutions like Northern, not within that space, but have to come into the market to put some construct around it and some things. And actually what they really have to do is they need to be accountable and responsible. So if they say this is right and it isn't, they have to fork out their own money to make that good. Because as a buyer at the moment in this market, the buyer is taking 100% of the risk throughout that whole food chain, that if anything goes wrong within the project, within the governance function, within the VVB, none of those firms today take any responsibility monetarily to making the buyer whole. And whilst that's the case, why would a buyer take on all that risk?
Right. So sometimes when I think about this, I'm like, okay, there is a role for standards bodies to set methodologies, and there is a claim that is then made by a company at the end of the process. And if I'm thinking, like, let's say there's a big institution that's like, hey, I will risk my own capital to say I'm going to do the methodology right, and I'm going to make sure that the claim is valid at the end. But I'm thinking, like, what organization would be willing to take on that risk, knowing that there's a lot of basically criticism, and it's kind of a hard job to do. And sometimes I end up being like, hey, should the government just do this? And because they're the ones both regulating the companies and setting the rules, like, they can have perfect de-risking, saying, no, if the project goes through this process, it can make this claim even if there's an error in the system, you could still make the claim, right? But that's not the case where if you just run the standards bodies and then there's a lawsuit against Apple for using this credit or something, then both Apple and Vera, for example, are sort of on the hook for addressing this problem, rather than the government just being like, well, this is the rules we made, this was the claim they made. Then it doesn't matter if there was an error, because on the whole, we can say even though there's some errors on the edges, the whole system is working pretty well. And I'm just curious how you, if you agree, like, is this a role for government to step in and be like, we are the participant, or is actually, this looks more like ISO or like these other standards bodies that have just developed so, or auditing bodies that have just developed so much that, it works.
Yeah. So I guess the problem with giving it to any government is that the government's got to care enough and put enough money towards it, and then really they're going to regulate. So
Mhm.
I don't think there's that many governments in the world right now that want to take on the ownership of, the market in this way. I think
Well,
the
to
US,
the contrary, like California does
uh,
this, Australia, like there are governments that do this. The US government right now, at least right now, probably not.
yeah,
Um,
but they don't want to take on the whole thing. They want to put the rules in place. So what they really need to be doing, and I think the CFTC has made a little bit of a movement towards this, is recently the CFTC has made it very clear that they own the carbon assets, both voluntary and compliance markets. So they own the asset, and they have taken enforcement action against the project developer for fraud and market manipulation. So now that they're starting to do that and they're starting to enforce the rules. So the question becomes, Troy, is where do you want the rules to be put in? So if you want the rules to go in through the US, which they are doing in certain places without a doubt, then you get arbitrage that you go, well, actually, I won't do this project in the US. I'll do it somewhere else because the rules are easier. As in, there may not be any rules. So carbon in the UK is a non regulated asset. Now, that means actually custodial banks can't look after carbon because I can't hold non regulated assets. If you go into other domiciles, then carbon is seen as a different asset. So the problem with having a government come in and make rules is people that don't like those rules just go elsewhere. Now, that might mean that a US entity that buys a carbon credit that is based in California has to meet those strict California based rules and has to put out certain things on their website that shows what they've done. If they think that that's onerous, they will just stop doing that or they'll go somewhere else. Right. And that's the part of the problem is that some firms will just move their bases around or their domicile to make the change. So really,
mhm.
this still has to come from the desire of businesses, certainly in the voluntary space, to want to take on these decisions. Now, do they want to run their own projects? I'd say that they don't in most cases. But actually, we're dealing with a lot of entities, a lot of institutions who are running their own projects and have invested in projects and are running them and managing them because they are worried about, therefore, if they have to do due diligence on somebody else's project and that still turns out to be not good, then who gets the rap? It's the company that's purchased the credit and retired it and made the claim. So they are making a decision around I think they're making decisions about buying from less projects because they're doing deeper due diligence on a fewer projects, which
Yeah.
tends to mean then that the projects that are going to do well are those that have got much larger project bases, larger credit numbers, larger income streams, because they're the ones that can then start to deal with these institutions. As a small project developer, having to deal with a large institution who might want to do 6 months due diligence, can't afford the time and effort which then may
Right.
turn out to be nothing. So you're starting to force then a market that looks like it's going to go to bigger players, and then a lot of the smaller deals just can't happen.
I think we're seeing the same, at least for the moment, where Earthshot is seeing a lot of durability in momentum, is these sort of like single sleeve corporate engagements where big infrastructure companies or energy companies or technology companies that are like, hey, I need to deploy $100 million, tell me how to do it, but I don't I want to take on as little risk as possible, And so that means rather than just, hey, blanket checks into 100 projects that are small, I actually want to be deeply involved in the project development process. So I have visibility on the de risking process. And actually, there aren't that many organizations that can actually address that and be like, yeah, we will basically go do custom project development with an experienced implementing party, Earthshot doing sort of all the compliance work so that the actual process of going through one of these standards bodies is de-risked in its own way. So it's sort of going above and beyond the rules, and then saying, hey, and I'm also either the single owner or the sole investor, or like having some governance involvement in that project. And that's where we're seeing a lot of durability from the last year, and much
Yeah.
less so in what was perhaps an original thesis a few years ago, which is like, oh, there's going to be this many to many marketplace where you're just going to have a website where you go and say like, oh yeah, I want to deploy $1 million into these projects, type, send them off. But that sort of covers up the risk that right now is inherent in the market that ideally would not exist because the rules were so well defined that you could actually do these blanket investments.
Yeah. So that I still think you're absolutely right, and we're seeing exactly the same things, right? And we're hearing the same things, which is bigger institutions. And quite frankly, one of the reasons we set our ecosystem up was I have large institutions who have scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that they will at some stage need to start purchasing credits for. Ideally, they would buy credits from a project developer or two that they've sort of fallen in love with. They love what that project developer does. They love how they work with the municipality that they're working in, or with the type of carbon credit that they're capturing, or the work that they're doing within the local community, right? That would then be a 15-year deal as to, I know I'm going to reduce my emissions every year, but I want to buy credits from you every year to do that. So how do I enter those agreements? And that means there's guaranteed cash flow for the project developer that they can redeploy. And so that was our original stance, which was we see these deals being sort of player to player, single decisions, but over 15 years. So you do your due diligence once and then you sort of, you run with it. That has definitely happened and is happening. Um, the place where we're seeing these sort of baskets of credits being purchased, which is more of a risk mitigation from if I buy 15 projects, because I haven't done my due diligence and I'm not going to do deep due diligence, I'm just going to spread my money across 10, 15 projects. I'm going to buy some credits from each. And then if there is a problem, from a sort of reversal point of view, I've sort of spread my risk. The problem around reputation, you can't get rid of, right? If you invest in a business and that turns out to be fraudulent, that reputational hit's going to come back to you. So that's why I think the bigger companies are spending their time doing the due diligence on one or two project developers that they can really now keep an eye on. And those that can't do that due diligence find these baskets because the risk is spread from a reversal, but they're still taking on the reputational risk.
So there's a few strategies that I can think of, but because it seems like this reputation risk is a real issue for a lot of organizations that is hindering making these investments or purchasing decisions, where if they're just like, don't worry, like you can absolutely make the claim that you're going to make with those credits 100%, I think there would be greater demand in the market today and we'd be seeing better ecological outcomes for this planet. Okay, so let's
Totally
say
agree.
that is a real issue. There's a few strategies. One is like, hey, the government, this was my earlier suggestion, the government just says, if you generate a credit, it is good. Even if 5% we know are not going to be good, we're just saying that they're good because overall the program is working. So that's one strategy. Another is that a private organization says, hey, we will be bundling a basket of credits together and kind of anonymizing them into the Earthshot credit or the Rubicon ton or the JP Morgan fractional credit that they may or may not be developing. Um, that's another strategy. I'm just curious, like, do you have suggestions on how we get over this reputation risk issue? Because I don't know, it still seems to be a problem.
Yeah, it does. So would the government take on a risk? So you're asking a government to take on some form of risk. So if they were to back the market and say all credits are good, and if they're not, well, I'm going to make them good, or don't worry about it, you can still claim your emission. There's a lot of risk there, because if that was a US, let's say it was a US government, I think they may do that for US entities
Hmm.
that are capturing CO2, avoiding CO2 in the US. But would they do it for a project developer in the Amazon rainforest that they've got very little oversight of, who might be selling credits at a cheaper price than the US generated ones? Is the US government really going to want to take on the responsibility for those credits being, no good in time? And I don't think they would. But if they have the right legal structures and regulations for internal credits, absolutely, I could see that being something that they would have to put the right regulations in place to do
Yeah.
that. And I think they are starting to do so. But I still think it's a push to then do it outside of your own domicile.
Hmm.
Having them in a non-transparent basket doesn't really get away from some of the problems. It just sort of pushes the problems elsewhere. So having a bunch of credits within a basket, somebody still has to do due diligence on those credits to ensure that they're still good, right? And therefore, the buyer of those credits in that basket, or in that non-transparent credit, has to understand what they are and has to make a decision that they want to buy them. If not, what are they actually
But
buying?
isn't the
Right? You're not
diligence
sure.
so like isn't the diligence supposed to be done by the standards body and the VVB? Right.
Correct. It
So
is.
what is not working about that? Because if you buy a credit, it should be good, right? And a reversal should be covered by these other mechanisms or insurance or something. So like what about the standards body and VVB system is not appropriately absorbing the risk? Is that because there are small nonprofits who don't have the financial acumen to like make good customers? Is it because the process itself is flawed in some way?
So I would imagine that the amount of risk we're talking about here is not as great as the market thinks it is.
Hmm.
So if we look at the problems that have been in the market over the last couple of years, it's been a very small number of project developers that have been raised to us as being fraudulent.
Right.
They just happen to be fairly big projects that were probably at the top 10% of credit sellers in the market. So is there a problem? There must be, right? Because that would have been picked up within the due diligence process of the applicable standards body, the verification process, right?
Hmm.
Somebody should have picked that up. You're absolutely right. That is their job. The fact that they didn't is your problem statement, right? So do you trust that there are groups out there that do it well? Yes, there are definitely groups out there that do it well. Were these just small issues? You'd hope so, because I think if there's another shock to the market in the voluntary space where another big project is found out to be fraudulent, I think we've got serious problems with where this market sits for a while.
Right.
But you're
Because
absolutely right.
maybe just digging in a little bit. So let's say the Kariba project or like some project that were like, hey, people have acknowledged that there was overcrediting or there's like a known issue. And on paper, many of these projects actually met the rules of the methodologies as they were written. Like, even if they get reputational criticism, the actual math that goes into that project, or like, um, and so the issue seems to be maybe, hey, the auditor didn't check the, didn't check something that was relevant, or, maybe the methodology needed to be updated. But okay, let's just say now actually those methodologies are updated, very rigorous, like, absolutely learn from the mistakes of a few years ago. But let's just say the
Yeah.
methodologies are perfect. Um, the auditors or VVBs, their job is to check to see that the reality on the ground matches, because there aren't people from Vera going to these sites. There's a third party that are going to the sites and interviewing people. um do, do you think that problem has been addressed, like, okay, with updated methodologies, or is there still like a systemic issue in the audit process, for example, in which case maybe, and because most of these VBBs are not big, they're like, 10,
Yeah. I
20
think that's
person teams. Some are larger, but it's not like the top audit organizations in the world are the ones that are running these audit processes necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would look at it this way, I guess, that if I've employed somebody and paid a fee for a verification report to be written, I would expect that that firm would do their job properly and then would stand behind that if they made a mistake.
Hmm.
And the way they stand behind that has got to be with capital. So that if I'm a purchaser and I'm purchasing credits from project A, which has been looked at by applicable standards body B, and it's been verified by VVBC, whichever, if those credits turn out to be not what I thought they were, one of those entities has got to be accountable and responsible for the mistake that was made. And therefore, one of those entities has got to make me good. Now, you can try and pass that off to insurance, but you shouldn't really be passing off to insurance negligence, right? Which is what you're
Hmm.
talking about within that structure, right? If there's a reversal event, I think insurance is okay for that because that's a thing that's happened, that's
Right.
been understood, taken into account within the methodology and the governance, and you've taken some insurance out to offset your risk. But negligence, somebody doing their job incorrectly, should be sought out with somebody making you good. Now, that doesn't happen today. So I think, yes, the methodologies are becoming more robust. And yes, the process is becoming tighter, but it still isn't perfect. And I think until it's perfect, we've got to worry then who's going to start investing into this market until they can work out what happens if. And come back to my earlier point, if I was a purchaser of credits and I've invested a couple of $1 million and bought some credits, and one of my three entities turns out to be, negligent within that process, I can't sue them. Because to your point, the
Hmm.
VBBs are quite small entities and they don't have any money, and they probably don't have insurance to pay me back. The verification bodies really don't have that much money, right? They're because they're generally charities, non for profits. They don't have lots of cash sat behind them. So even if they are negligent, you can't get your money out of the process.
Hmm.
And so the model has got to change slightly so that everyone becomes accountable and responsible.
So we've painted a little bit of a dismal picture the last 20 minutes of the way things are. I'm curious, like, okay, you know, Anthony Stevens, 3 steps to make this market work in the next few years that can actually have it reach the level of impact that we need to. Because, there isn't a clear other financing mechanism to do what we all know needs to be done, restoring and protecting nature at planetary scale. Like that is sort of what Earthshot is about. And I think where there's generally very strong consensus of like, yeah, we all need to go agree that we're doing this. It's just somehow the mechanism is a bit uh clunky right now.
Exactly.
So your
Yeah,
three
totally
steps
agree.
to you know
Look,
fixing this.
so I think I maybe not, I hope it hasn't come across as dismal. I think what it is probably realistic as to where we are in this current market cycle, right? We're in a dip. And the problem with when you're in a dip is you all start to overanalyze all of those things that you should do. So I think the market restructure is, I think, relatively straightforward. You make the different groups accountable and responsible, and that's the first thing that you would want to put in place because that then builds trust, and it builds trust that the buyer, who's the one that's taking the risk here by buying the credits, the buyer wants to and feels comfortable in the market, knowing that it's regulated and you don't want it to be over-regulated because that might stifle innovation. But you want it to be regulated in a way, like the CFTC are doing, that if you commit fraud or market or manipulate the market, the regulators will be able to ensure that you are taken to task. And that will hopefully deter people from doing it. So if you can start building trust by making different groups accountable, and I think they are moving that way, Troy, without a doubt, they're moving to become specialists in what they're doing rather than trying to do the whole market end to end. That trust will then bring in more buyers because they will feel comfortable that the credits that they are buying are good. And to your point, right, that is what the buyers are looking for is how do they get that? And it could be government influence, it could be market themselves, it could be new players coming in. But that trust is really important so the buyer knows that what they're buying is what they think it is, which quite frankly is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, that they can use as their emission claim. So the market structure is really important. The problem is as well is we're not just thinking about our market. There's lots of markets where this is happening outside. You've got the influence of the compliance markets. You've got the influence from COP coming through, where lots of entities are saying this voluntary market is too small. It's not going to scale. And if it doesn't, why are we spending time on it when we should be looking at just bigger things through 6.2? That is all going to come to, a head over the next few years. But the reason we're in the voluntary market is because we think it's super important that money can go very quickly to individuals who can make a difference instantly. And the problem with some of the other markets that are slightly bigger is you don't know where the money goes. It gets there a bit slower. Is it going right down to the grassroots? So we're working with a project developer down in the Amazona, a company called Go Balance, that are running about 1.4 million hectares of land on behalf of the municipality. Every credit they sell, money from that project goes directly back into the municipality, and they're the people that can protect their own land better than anybody else. So I wouldn't want to see the market move out from the voluntary space, but I think the market has just got to grow up to this point where it goes, what have we done badly, and how do we change so that the market, the participants, are more comfortable with what they're doing? And at the moment, there's just so much going on that no one really knows what to do. And it doesn't help that you've got governments making decisions around climate policies where they're trying to, nudge people away from making climate decisions, or at least nudge them away from making those decisions public, which is no good for any of us, because we know, this market has to grow because it's the quickest way to make a change.
Yeah. Um, Maybe one last sort of content specific question related to Northern Trust's platform. Like, how can someone engage with your platform? Do you have to be a customer of the bank or a registry slash standards body? Is there a way, are you going to have like, hey, an API for a marketplace to buy and sell credits and run your own transactions? Like, what's the way to engage with what you're doing today?
Yeah, so we probably should have covered this right at the very beginning, right, Troy?
Yeah.
We get carried away. So we are currently representing 20 project developers on platform where we are recording all of their credits. And we have customers on the other side who, yes, they're customers of the banks and they can buy those credits. So you've got a sort of peer-to-peer model where they create their legal construct and settle their transactions all in one place. We also have an ability to link via our APIs to other standards bodies. So we're linked to about 7 today. We've got a couple more coming through, where if you have your credits where you're using the applicable standards body and they have got a deal with us, then the credits can be moved from their register onto ours. So we're not double counting. We're ensuring that they are de-recorded from the first registry and they're re-recorded on ours. But there's a way that you can then view where they're sitting. So you can see where the credit sits. So if you're dealing with one of those registries, we can take that information and show it, and then it's a financial asset on platform. We
Can
also
you
have
can
a
you
structured.
share which registries those are?
Yeah, so we're
Or
linked up at the moment with in the US. So we got B Carbon, Carbon Path, with ICR, with CSI. We've got other conversations going on at the moment with, I'd say, the bigger players, the sort of the 4 or 5 well-known groups. But we started very much with, I'd say, the sort of the ones that are growing, because those are the groups that could understand the benefits quickly of having a Northern Trust come and help support them with their registry requirements. We've had one registry, the NFS Eco, who've actually outsourced their entire registry requirements to us because they've looked at what we do and go, you could do this better than us. So we've taken on that whole as a registry service agreement, and there's a couple of others in the pipeline. So yeah, we're linked to 7. We've in effect outsourced 1 completely to us.
Cool. And
We
so what
knew
it
that.
sounds like is that the major voluntary or like compliance or government systems don't yet use Northern Trust. Also, maybe because right now they get paid for the activities that Northern Trust would take over for them.
Exactly right.
Maybe an issue.
So there is a push to engage with all of them, and we have engaged with most. The decision point for most of them, as to your point, is how do they make this financially viable to themselves? If they stop taking revenue from their, recordation process on their registry, how do they make that? So what we've done in most cases, in all cases, is we've made sure that they're not out of pocket for those decisions at this point. So they can come to us, we can do our work, we can provide that underlying infrastructure, and we've made sure that the applicable standards bodies are not out of pocket.
Cool. Um, Before we wrap up, I'm just curious, if you had a magic wand right now, also coming out of COP, there was a lot of potential action coming out. But just like one magic wand for the next year, what would happen in this field that would, you know, support the overall mission that we're all on, which is the restoration, protection of nature, the balancing of climate, the, ongoing flourishing of civilization. What's your magic wand moment for this year?
Gosh. So we're nearly at the end of the year, so hopefully I won't
Okay,
get much done
2026.
this
We'll
year.
call it
Let's look at
2026.
2026. So I think our magic wand would be, I would like the market to understand what the asset is that we're dealing with. And I think if you can understand the asset, and because we've brought a fairly new concept to market around how do we see the asset and how do we think the regulators see it and legally what is it, I would like that asset to be understood and people go, yeah, I agree with you. And then we can work out then how to provide the right infrastructure. And then I'd like the rest of the world to agree with the US's opinion on what this asset is. Because if you've got a global view of the asset, it's so much easier then to work around domiciles. If in the US it's going to be a commodity, and in the UK it's an unregulated asset, and in Singapore it's something else, you've caused yourself more problems because you just move around to arbitrage the process. So I think a global understanding of what the asset is would be my magic wand moment for next year.
Okay, so everyone listening or watching, you can hold that magic wand along with Anthony and Northern Trust. So thanks for sharing all your insight, and I think into a sort of like a level or like a space within carbon markets that isn't touched on very often, which is like this underlying infrastructure, the underlying like settlement transactions, ledger or registry. So thanks for sharing. Really
You're
appreciate it.
welcome. Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Sean.